Good morning, everyone. So, for today, we'll be looking at a very interesting topic, yet considered to be one of the most difficult topics in medicine, which is the brainstem syndromes. So, how do we approach these brainstem syndromes and how do we simplify it is what we'll be looking at. So, what is the brainstem? The brainstem basically comprises of three sections, which is the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. So as we recollect from neuroanatomy, the midbrain is basically a butterfly-like structure, the pons is basically a bridge-like structure, and the medulla is like the mini spinal cord. So there are multiple things that are happening in these levels. So what are the structures which are found at each level? We can find cranial nerve nuclei, we can find the ascending and descending tracts, which basically carry the motor and sensory sensations to and from the spinal cord, and we can also find the reticular activating system. So how do we remember these multiple tracts and multiple cranial nerve nuclei is what we will be looking at. So let us come to rule number 1. Embryologically, if you look at the neuroanatomical development, all things which are motor, be it the motor cranial nerves, be it the motor fibers, they are generally arranged medially. And all things sensory, such as the sensory tracts which carry pain, temperature, touch from the spinal cord to the brain or backward, are usually arranged laterally, right? So the rule number 1 that we have to look at is the structures which are arranged medially. So this you can remember by the 4 M's. So what are the 4 M's? We have the MLF. The MLF is nothing but the medial longitudinal fasciculus, which is responsible for the horizontal gaze. Then we have the medial lemniscus. The medial lemniscus basically carries the posterior column sensations. What are the posterior column sensations? It is nothing but vibration and proprioception. What is the third M structure that we find? They are the motor nuclei of the cranial nerves. Which cranial nerves? That we will be looking at. And what is the last M? Like I told you, all the motor structures are generally arranged medially. So the motor fibers of the corticospinal tract is the 4th M structure which is found medially. Okay, what are the structures that are arranged laterally? So you remember it with the 4S. So what are the structures? As a thumb rule, we'll remember it as all the sensory sensations. So the sensations of the body are carried by which tract? It's easy, it is the spinothalamic tract. So it is arranged laterally. Then we have the spinocerebellar tract. The third S here is the sympathetic chain. And the last is the spinal nucleus of trigeminal nerve. Right? So, the first rule that we have to remember here is the 4 M's and the 4S. What are the 4 M's? They are basically the structures which are arranged medially, which is the MLF, the medial lemniscus, the motor nuclei of cranial nerves, and the motor fibers, which is the corticospinal tract. The 4 S's are arranged laterally, which is the spinothalamic tract, which carries the pain and temperature sensations from the body to the brain. Then we have the spinocerebellar tracts, the sympathetic chain, and the spinal nucleus of trigeminal nerve. Easy. So rule number 1 is done. Rule number 2. How do we remember the arrangement of the cranial nerve nuclei? So this rule is extremely simple. We all know 12 by 3 is 4, right? So what is this 12, what is this 3, and what is the 4? So we have 12 cranial nerves. And how many sections do we have in the brainstem? 3, which is the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. So that is exactly what is depicted here. So 12 cranial nerves have to be distributed between the midbrain, pons, and the medulla. That means that we have 4 cranial nerves at each level. Easy. So we have cranial nerve 1, 2, 3, and 4 at the level of the midbrain. cranial nerves 5, 6, 7 and 8 at the level of the pons. And at the level of the medulla, we have the cranial nerves 9, 10, 11 and 12. Easy. So which are the cranial nerves at the midbrain? We have the first 4, then the next 4 at the level of the pons and the next 4 at the level of the medulla. But as we all know, anything in medicine is not without an exception. So here we'll have to learn a few exceptions as well. So what is the first exception? Cranial nerve 1 and cranial nerve 11. So we just take them out of the equation because they do not relate to any structures in the brainstem. Okay, the second exception, cranial nerve 5. The cranial nerve 5, which is basically the nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, is completely different in itself because it has 3 parts. What are the 3 parts of the nucleus of the trigeminal nerve? So it has 3 nuclei which is present at each level. So the first one is the mesencephalic, which is responsible for the jaw jerk. Then we have the chief sensory. And then we have the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. Alright. So what is so interesting about this trigeminal nerve nucleus is that each nucleus is present at each level. In the sense, if we draw the trigeminal nerve nucleus, the mesencephalic nucleus is at the level of the midbrain, the chief sensory nucleus is at the level of the pons, and the spinal nucleus extends up to the medulla. So this is the second exception that we learn. The third exception to the rule is the nucleus of cranial nerve 8, which is the vestibulocochlear nerve. So this again has 2 nuclei. The cochlear nuclei, which is present at the level of the pons, and the vestibular nuclei, which is present at the level of the medulla. Easy. So these are the only 3 exceptions that you have to learn. That the trigeminal nerve is present at all 3 levels. The cranial nerve 8 nucleus has 2 parts. One is at the level of pons and the vestibular nucleus, which is at the level of the medulla. And cranial nerve 1 and 11 have nothing to do with this. Okay. So this brings us to a very, very easy and pictorial representation of this arrangement of the brainstem nuclei, what we call as the brainstem triangle. Right? So there is nothing in nature that is called as the brainstem triangle. This is just an easy way of representing the brainstem cranial nerve nuclei. Okay. So this triangle is basically again divided into 3 parts, which is nothing but the midbrain, the pons and the medulla. Alright. So now we'll see and try to arrange these cranial nerves topographically onto this triangle. Okay, cranial nerve 1. Cranial nerve 1 is nothing related to the midbrain, pons or medulla, so we remove it. Cranial nerve 2. Cranial nerve 2, is it related to the brainstem? Yes, it is. The light reflex goes to the pretectal nucleus, which is present in the midbrain. So cranial nerve 2 does not have any nucleus per se, but is basically involved in the light reflex pathway. Okay, now we come to cranial nerve 3 and 4. As we all know, where are the cranial nerves 3 and 4 located? They are located at the level of the midbrain. Now, are they motor or are they sensory? So, as we learned, all motor nuclei are present medially. 3rd and 4th cranial nerve are motor cranial nerves. So, they are located medially. Okay. Now, we come to cranial nerve 5. Cranial nerve 5 is our dearest exception, which is present at all levels. However, as I said before, only motor nuclei are present medially, since the trigeminal nerve has both motor as well as sensory actions. It is present slightly laterally. Okay. So if we have to draw the 5th cranial nerve or represent it in this triangle, it will be present at the level of the pons as well as at the level of the medulla. The S stands for sensory. So the sensory nuclei at the level of the pons, at the level of medulla. Okay. We come to cranial nerve 6. Cranial nerve 6, we all have remembered LR6, SO4, So cranial nerve 6 is basically the supply to the lateral rectus. So it is a completely motor nerve, right? At what level is it present? It's present at the level of the pons, so we place it here. Cranial nerve 7, now this task becomes very easy. Again, it's a mixed cranial nerve at the level of pons, so it cannot be present medially, it is present laterally. Cranial nerve 8, again as I mentioned, it is one of the exceptions that I had mentioned here. So the cochlear nucleus, again sensory, so it is present laterally, and it is present laterally in the medulla as well. 9th and 10th cranial nerves, they do have motor, but they do have sensory supply as well, basically sensations of the larynx and the pharynx, and hence they are also present slightly laterally but not completely. And we come to the last cranial nerve, which is the 12th cranial nerve. 12th cranial nerve basically has only motor supply to the tongue, and it's a completely motor nerve at the level of the medulla. So it is present medially, right? So after this entire task, what we have understood is the motor nuclei of the cranial nerves that are present medially are only 3, 4, 6 and 12. 3 and 4 at the level of the midbrain, 6 at the level of the pons, and 12th cranial nerve at the level of the medulla. Easy? Okay. Now we'll see how do we apply these aspects into our understanding of the brainstem syndromes. Okay. So, here I have already placed the arrangement, the rule number 1 and rule number 2 onto a single slide so that we can see how we can apply it. Okay, so in your question, if you have to find out something like all of the following are seen in lateral medullary syndrome except, okay, and it becomes very confusing to remember ipsilateral, contralateral, sensory laws, hemisensory laws, etc. So that is the reason why if we make a pictographic memory of these structures, we can easily solve any MCQ related to brainstem syndromes. Okay, so now we'll look at lateral medullary syndrome. What is the lateral medullary syndrome? What are the structures that can be involved? What are we focusing at? The medulla. Are we looking at the medial part of the medulla? No, we are looking at the lateral part of the medulla. Okay, so what are the cranial nerves which are going to be affected in the lateral part of the medulla? It is exactly, so that's great. We are looking at cranial nerves 9 and 10. So if cranial nerves 9 and 10 are involved, what do we have? Hoarseness and dysphagia. Cranial nerve 5, is it the motor or is it the sensory? No, it is the spinal nucleus of trigeminal nerve. The spinal nucleus of trigeminal nerve is basically responsible for pain and temperature sensations from the face. So, if the fifth or the spinal nucleus of trigeminal nerve is lost or affected, what do we get is the ipsilateral loss of pain and temperature sensations from the face. Easy. Now, 8th cranial nerve, which nucleus we have heard? It is the vestibular nucleus of cranial nerve 8. That's exactly what we are looking at here. This is exactly where we are focusing. So, the vestibular nucleus of cranial nerve 8 will lead to, if that is affected, it will lead to ipsilateral vertigo and vomiting. Okay? Okay. Now we have only looked at the cranial nerves which can be involved in lateral medullary syndrome. But what have we forgotten? We have forgotten the 4 S's, right? So we add on the 4 S's which can be involved. What is the first S? The spinothalamic tract. If the spinothalamic tract is involved, what do we get? Contralateral loss of pain and temperature from the body. So one very important point that we have to remember is, one is it is contralateral and it is from the body. Why not the face? Because we have already seen ipsilateral loss of pain and temperature from the face, because the sensations from the face are carried by the spinal nucleus of trigeminal nerve. What is the next S that can be lost? Because this is a lateral, so only the lateral structures are involved, only the S's will be involved, which is the spinocerebellar tract, which can cause ipsilateral ataxia, right? Then last but not the least, we have the involvement of the sympathetic chain, which can cause ipsilateral Horner syndrome. Okay, what about the spinal nucleus of trigeminal nerve? We have already covered it, right? So this is a very easy way to remember lateral medullary syndrome. So I have covered the basic approach to the arrangement of the fibers and the cranial nerve nuclei in the brainstem in a nutshell, and going forth we'll look at various other syndromes and how to solve any MCQs based on this. Thank you.